yes.
Hello and welcome back to another API review session. Today we have a mixed bag of various red things and then hopefully some non-red stuff. Ironically, we start with a non-red item because one of our people has a conflict later, so we will do this first and then we do the other ones. All right, do you want to give an overview of this one?
Sure. So the background behind this is System Data SQL Client used to be part of .NET proper, and so it had a few references to internal calls on some hot paths when building data types. Specifically, these ones tended to like copy byte arrays and whatnot, which is very inefficient when you're building data sets. So in order to have these use proper public APIs, we need these exposed as new public APIs so that we can use them in Microsoft Data SQL Client, which now ships outside of .NET proper. So that's the reason for the interfaces, and they're really they're almost the original internal methods and whatnot as new public APIs, and they've been massaged a little bit to be a little bit more formal.
Gotcha.
So from internal representation seems like a pretty weird and generic name. Is there a better name for the representation?
So I'm not the original proposer for this. It's from one of our community contributors. And there's some more discussion down about why he chose these names. And I'm not against any of the names. I don't have a whole lot of strong opinions one way or the other.
I mean, honestly, like, given that it's all talking about bytes here anyway, it seems like, or at least, I guess not all of them, but some of them do. So, like, we could just call this, like, from bytes to bytes for those things.
The very top one, the SQL date time, was from internal representation, takes two ints, where one is apparently the number of days since 1/1/1900, and the other is the number of ticks that must be less than the number of ticks in a day.
Right.
So it's a day code and a time code. So that'd be like from time or from day and time code or something.
Yeah, also, why does it return a daytime, not a SQL daytime? It's a bit weird to say SQL daytime from internal representation, then you get back a daytime, not a SQL daytime. That seems odd.
I agree. I mean, getting a date time may be intentional from it, where they're just trying to use its SQL dates or SQL date times internal coding and then exposing that out. But I think from an API shape, it should be give me the SQL date time from the day code and the time code, and then call the to date time off of SQL date time.
Right.
Yeah, because the internal method that they're wanting to make public is called to date time, day part, time part, which returns a date time, not a SQL date time.
I'm more familiar with the SQL money, SQL decimal, SQL binary lines. The SQL date time, I don't know how important it is, but I do know when I had to fix this in Microsoft Data SQL Client, I really didn't have to change anything here. And this is a perf and compliance issue. So if there's problems with the from internal representation on SQL date time, we can have more conversation about that on the issue.
Yeah, I mean,
But
it's really just about, like, if you want to expose public APIs, we should just make them proper public APIs and not just expose whatever internal things we currently have, right? I understand that that's a compliance issue that we basically call into private APIs otherwise, but I think the whole point is to have, proper public APIs, right? So we should just treat them as a public API and then do the proper design work for those, and not just do the minimum amount of work possible to address the compliance issue.
Yeah, because I mean, the routine's also not hard. So if you have a don't use reflection, just copy it. But
there's that too. But I think that, on decimal, what's the return value? Do you know? Is it void? Does it just write to the span?
Where's that one coming from? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, the other thing that I find somewhat surprising is that the shape and the data types are super non-uniform, right? Sometimes it's a long, sometimes it's a byte array, sometimes it's a span of units. So it's a bit
yeah, they're very specific to the internals of how the data is represented in SQL.
Right.
But that's because that's so we don't have to do any conversions when we're converting between the types we get on the wire, or the bytes we get on the wire, and the public, the public types.
Yeah, like for the top one, I think it would be better as public static SQL date time from parts, day part with a capital P, time part with a capital P. And then from that, you can call dot to date time.
I believe here we specifically need the date time type, though.
Right, but SQL date time has a way to get a date time off of it, right?
No, I think that's what the purpose of this is. I guess the reason for these types is so that we don't have to. We don't have any easy ways of getting these types without doing more expensive operations. And these are on paths that we really need to remain optimized, right?
Yeah, if that's the case, I mean, I'm not opposed to a helper. It just seems, from the naming convention wise, it looks like a factory, right? If you invoke it statically, it would say SQL datetime from internal representation. I think it would be very surprising if that doesn't return a SQL datetime. But I mean, you could easily have a different name for the method, right? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it makes no sense there from a public caller because they can't see the day part and the time part. Those are just internal fields on the struct.
So on that one, like I said, I'm okay if that actually doesn't happen because we've duplicated the code in Microsoft Data SQL Client.
Right. Because the answer for this one feels like if it's needed to talk about the day part and the time part, it would be SQL date time from parts, day part and time part, and then we add a method that I'm surprised doesn't already exist, which is to date time. So you can get a date time back out of a SQL date time. But the way as proposed there, I don't think it's a good fit.
Okay.
Let me shuffle things around here in the notes a little bit. Okay, so if we had to name it, how would we name it? If you want to keep the shape, or you're opposed to the shape as well, Jeremy?
I'm opposed to a static on SQL date time returning a date time and taking an input that is not a SQL date time. Like, it shouldn't be on that type unless it's unless it fits.
So is in
Oh,
date.
you can't. There is a way to get a date time. It's value. It's a property called value.
But so the date part and time part, are these fields on datetime, or are they like something that is specific to SQL datetime?
Those are fields on SQL datetime.
So to look and see how this is used, this would be called internally when the SQL client is building a datetime from the TDS data coming in from the server. So we're getting 2 ints from the server, and we need to build a datetime object.
And what do you do with the datetime?
It probably gets passed back to the user eventually, or the application.
Right. But if this was public static SQL datetime from parts, then the serialization there would be possible if you'd get the SQL datetime, which is a struct, so you're taking your 2 ints and just prefixing them with the Boolean that says it's not null. And then you would call SQL datetime.value. And that would just give you back now the datetime version of the day part and time part, and it would make sense why it was on SQL datetime, because it's SQL's input, and then that instance returns the datetime.
And that's what I was asking. Okay. What happens to the datetime? Because if you service it back to the user, wouldn't you return it back as a SQL datetime anyways?
I think it depends on which method they're using. But again, this one's not one of the high priority ones in my opinion. If SQL datetime, if this one doesn't make a public API, I'm not worried about it at all. It's really the other ones that I'm more concerned with. So we can remove that one from the proposal if you just don't like it.
All right, then let's talk about SQL Money then.
The important one here would be get internal representation. I think the static is the same thing as well, no, that one's a SQL Money type.
Yeah, this one makes more sense for inputs and outputs, right? Because you basically have a long representing a SQL Money, and you basically have a way to get the long, and you have to way to convert it from that long. That makes total sense for me.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I like the name particularly, but I think from a from a shape first point of view, it makes sense to me. Let me just quickly see what names we normally use for this, if we have it at all.
And this is literally from the SQL representation, the TDS spec representation. So
yeah. So in decimal, we just call it bits, get bits, and from bits, basically.
I mean, calling it from TDS value and get TDS value is not informative, but it's also not terrible. You need to know what TDS is.
I mean, that also works for me. I mean, then you make it at least very clear what internal representation you're referring to.
Right.
Yeah, that's not bad. What was the name from TDS to TDS? Is that
from? Yeah.
I was from TDS value and get TDS value. Was my straw man.
That works for me. Yeah, I can live with that. I can also live with something like, get raw value or get bits or something to that extent. I don't know. To me, internal representation always has some sort of it feels like a hack.
Yep. Yeah, that's why I'm much happier if we name the internal representation, which in this case apparently is from a spec called tabular data stream.
Right.
So.
Was that what TDS stands for? I didn't know that. All right, then SQL decimal. I guess it's the same thing, except the shape here is very different. So Jeremy, you have opinions on the shape of APIs that take writable spans, right?
If the current answer is the proposal should have said void, then instead it should say int, and it should return the number of byte or number of elements it wrote, not bytes, because this one isn't bytes.
And you would still call it get something?
I mean, it's.
So if we turn this into get TDS value, it's basically returning 4 uints that represent the decimal.
I mean, I'm fine with get TDS value because again, it doesn't mean anything to anybody.
The original shape of the method was 4 uint out parameters.
4 did you say 4 uints?
So it was uint, like uint value 1, uint value, or uint out value 1, uint out value 2. I don't remember if it was value specifically, but you get the point.
Oh, so one SQL decimal is just 2 uints?
It's 4 uints.
4 uints?
Yeah.
So, Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but we do have APIs where we don't do the try pattern when you can predict the size, right? So it would be fine to just say get and still return the number of elements, even if you know it's always 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you still want int on there?
Yep, it just says return 4.
Okay.
You have a free register. May as well use it. It might help somebody one day.
Yeah, so the rationale for this is just the composability when you have multiple APIs that write to a span, right? You need to advance at some point. And so it's nice if all the APIs have the same shape, so you don't have to do crazy inlining or crazy incrementing.
Right, so you can say offset plus equal value dot get TDS value of the span that you're writing to, and instead of you call it and then say offset plus equal 4.
Okay.
It's like where'd the 4 come from?
And then presumably the parameter would be named destination rather than value.
Correct, because we're writing to it.
Okay. So now I have int get TDS value span uint destination.
Sounds good.
All right. Then the next one would be, and you don't need to, yeah, the other question is you don't need the inverse version of that? Getting SQL decimal from the span?
I don't think so.
That seems odd.
I know.
It's like it's a one-way. Like normally I would expect these to come in pairs.
Because I see a constructor that uses a bunch of Hungarian and then takes a data 1, 2, 3, and 4. But if that's the case, then does the TDS value not need to expose the precision scale and positivity? Or maybe those are just already exposed on properties and what you're missing is the data 1 through 4.
So if we had it, it would be SQL money from TDS value read-only span of uint source, right? That would be the shape if we wanted to add it.
We'll run SQL decimal.
Oh, sorry, yeah, of course.
Right, because I think, so like if you go to APIs.net, the longest constructor for SQL decimal takes the 4 values. It takes them as ints instead of uints. But it also takes 2 bytes and a bool. But it looks like precision is already a property and scale is already a property. And is positive as a property. So what's missing on the public API is getting the for int spec.
Interesting.
So I think it is already possible. It seems weird to me that they're mixing int in the constructor and uint in the TDS export, but
yeah, and presumably the precision, scale, and positive you just get from properties, right? So,
right.
What is bin data then? Isn't that? Oh, that's a byte array. Yeah, I guess you don't get the actual 4 pages out of it.
Right. So apparently, if you want to serialize a SQL decimal, you would read the 3 properties called get TDS value, as cast that from uint back to int, and then you can call the int constructor passing 0, 1, 2, and 3. Well, values 0, 1, 2, and 3. Ugly, but it works.
Yeah. All right, SQL decimal we just talked about. So SQL binary now, we have rep bytes. Presumably that means you don't copy?
Right.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on this, Jeremy? I mean, normally we don't like APIs like that, right?
We don't like APIs that make it unclear what's going on. If this is specifically a no copy version, then it's fine. I don't have super strong feelings on the name here. Wrap bytes seems, I can believe that is a don't mess with the array, just hold on to the reference and let it go somewhere else.
I mean, do we have even APIs like this? I am not aware of an API that would do that in the framework.
I know with RFC 3161 timestamp token, we added a Boolean copy data, so you could say false and give the value ownership instead of having it make a copy. We probably have other places that hold the reference instead of making a copy.
I mean, I know that we talked about the construct an immutable array for like 3 months before we finally agreed on a shape.
Right. Well, because now that we have, so if we have something, spanified, now we have an easier way of signaling if it's holding the reference or not, which is if it has an overload that takes read-only memory, it's holding the reference, and if it has an overload that takes read-only span, it's holding the value. I guess if it takes memory, it's also holding the reference and then plans on writing to it. But so we have a way of signaling it better now. It does require somebody to understand what span and memory are to understand the signal, but we technically have a way now. I don't know that I can easily find constructors that take read-only memory and then look for overloads. But
yeah, I mean, it's probably a bad idea for a constructor, right? Like it probably would go something like a named method, right, to actually express the no copy semantics. I mean, wrap bytes seems a bit odd, but I guess that does convey it. At least I understood what it meant. But I mean, you could also call from bytes no copy. I mean, that makes it even more explicit, I guess.
indeed, or from bytes with a Boolean copy data.
Yeah, although on the call side, that unless you use named arguments, it's a bit unclear what's happening, right?
Indeed.
I think I would probably not go with the Boolean. I would probably make it a named method. But I don't have super strong opinions on this. It just seems like something that we should have a naming convention for. But I guess it's a highly specialized API, so maybe we don't need one. So we cool with the proposal as is, or do we want to change the name?
I don't have strong feelings. It's probably not the best name, but
It's also not
it doesn't feel like the kind of thing somebody's going to walk into and then have an expectation that then gets shattered. It doesn't say a whole lot, and it gives that in return.
All right, so then hold on, where is this? So this is what I have. Does this look good to people? I capitalized the P in part. I hope that is okay.
Yeah, that was part of my suggestion.
So for the SQL datetime, we're going to keep the SQL datetime, and the way to use that would be just to use SQL, the returning object, as a dot value that returns the datetime object.
I mean, that would basically be the suggestion, right?
Okay.
If you want the API, I think that seems cleaner
Okay.
than. I mean, we could also have Jeremy opposes this, but I would be fine with a helper method that is just not named from, because from to me kind of implies you need to return the thing that you're on. It's like SQL datetime dot from. You better return a SQL datetime, but if you call it SQL datetime, 2 datetime from parts, it's like, well, I mean, you get what you're asking for. So it's a bit unusual to put it here, but it seems if the format is very specific to how SQL datetime represents datetime, then that seems also fine. API.
Yeah, if we needed a direct one, like adding something like datetime from parts would be reasonable, but I think it would require that we also had the SQL datetime from parts, because it's weird that this type would talk about these values only in terms of it can build a datetime and not that it can build the type that it's using as its internal storage.
Yeah, I would agree with
that's
that.
the part that felt really weird, is why is it exposing a helper for a thing that nobody's allowed to know about?
Yeah, also
Okay,
performance-wise, I'm not sure that the dot value is the thing that wrecks your performance here, right? Because, I mean, you just constructed SQL datetime, which is presumably cheap.
It's a struct, so it's just those two ints plus a bool.
Right.
On SQL decimal, I had we had originally said get TDS value, and you have from TDS value.
Yeah, it should have been get.
Sorry, that was copy paste probably. Yeah.
I also had 2 TDS value on SQL money, but if you prefer, or I had get TDS value on SQL money, but if you prefer 2, that's fine too.
Yeah, I don't know why I have 2 there. I think it's just again copy paste. 2 TDS value works for me as well.
Well, 2 is what you wrote. I don't care about get or 2. 2 and from are a more natural pair than get and from, but get and from is also a reasonable pair.
Yeah, sorry. I think no. This should be closer to what we discussed.
So, yeah, I'm fine with that.
Sweet.
All right. Let's see if there's anything we missed from chat since Emo's screen isn't refreshing.
Oh, it's not. No, there's nothing. The only thing I have is a good evening from Frederick.
Yeah, Frederick suggested instead of the span writing when being get TDS value, he suggests write TDS value, which I guess does make a little bit more sense for a span writing thing.
I see. Internal error. I guess Jeremy was right.
Kevin was right.
Yeah, I don't think I can refresh this without disconnecting here. So what was this, right?
Instead of get TDS value, writing to a span, write TDS value.
On SQL decimal. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, that works.
Frederick also asked why not use the SQL money constructor that takes so long. The answer is because it multiplies that long by like 10,000. So it's, while it is the same data type, it's not the same value. And then Frederick also says SQL money from TDS values should be single.
Yes. Singular. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, which one is that? Oh, I paid
SQL money.
Yep. Apparently I can't type today. Sweet. Going.
Gone.
It's good to me.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, David. And then
thank you.
Let us know if there's anything that shows up when you're implementing it.
All right.
All right. So then, Jeremy, you're up.
Okay. All right. So, continuing on things that a CA needs to do, even though you shouldn't be writing your own CA in .NET. One of the ways that certificates are found as a match during a chain walk is a certificate has a thing called a subject key identifier extension. It usually has one. They're supposed to have one. And we have a rich type for subject key identifier, but then you're supposed to match the subject key identifier to the authority key identifier. It actually goes the other way. The child's authority matches the issuer's subject, but right now we don't have a way of creating authority key identifier extensions, so anybody who's trying to be a CA can't embed them in the certificates that they write. Again, you shouldn't write your own CA. You should use a commercial product because writing a CA is hard. But given that, so we have, a standardish set of constructors. You can build it from existing data, or you can have the default one, which we need for complicated plumbing reasons. So the authority key identifier has 3 values inside the encoding, and they're all optional. So there's key identifier, which is just a sequence of bytes. Then there's a thing called issuer, which is extremely complicated. And then there's serial number, which is a sequence of bytes. The extremely complicated thing from issuer is almost always an X500 distinguished name, but it can also be more complicated than that. So on that one, I proposed it as raw issuer, which is here's the bytes if you want to do weird stuff. And if it was exactly only an X500 distinguished name, then it would assign simple issuer. But if it's a complicated value, then simple issuer will be null, and you get to go read the raw issuer and figure out what it means. I can throw any number of 9s out there, and that is the number of people that will be able to use simple issuer or raw issuer will itself be null. Because I've never ever seen this, and it's stupid that the encoding allows it. I have opinions.
So when you say simple, you just mean like it's a, you can like is that I guess an X509 concept, or is that just you saying, oh, I happen to know the format, so I give you back an extinguished name?
So it's a me concept of the encoding of the issuer said it only had one value, and that one value was an X500 distinguished name. So that this is the encoding was simple and you can understand it and you can talk about it in terms of types that we have in .NET.
Gotcha.
AKA, it is exactly equal to a certificate.subject or a certificate.issuer value from some particular certificate.
Yeah, so I think I made the same suggestion last time. The problem with simple is that it might be a moving target, right? If this thing is, an industry standard for 15 years, it's not going to change, right? But like, it might be better to just call it like named issue or something, so you make it clear what,
Sure.
what it is. But
we can do that. This has been an industry standard for RFC 3280.
45 years or something, no?
It has been an industry standard since 2002, and in fact, issuer and serial number are on the chopping block. The public internet is either no longer allowed to use them or is about to not be allowed to use them. But technically, they exist in the encoding.
I see.
So the issuer field is not going to get more complicated. It's going to get less used.
I see. Well, then I guess that works as well. So another question I have is like you made this whole intro about like don't write your own CA, but if you do write your own CA, you use some APIs that make that happen. So can you explain that disconnect a little bit?
So the answer is writing a CA is hard. If you're writing a CA, and you're doing it for anything other than a test system, there's a whole bunch of rules you should follow and best practices you should do, and depending on what you're doing and who you're talking to, legal compliance starts actually coming into the thing. Like, if you are a Microsoft product and you're running a CA, then there are real serious internal policies and rules on what you do. And basically the answer is you have to just use the one team at Microsoft that runs CAs. Like, we have a dedicated team for running all of our certificate authorities. But we've had a number of people who have, there's scenarios of like, they're building up a tiny Kubernetes cluster and they want to issue certificates to the nodes as they pop online, and it's only for internal communication, and they need to be able to build these things so that their little private network can play nicely. And so we understand that they have needs, but I think that a lot of people think that being a CA is easier than it is. So I keep saying it's a bad idea, but if you're doing it, we're going to help you do it right.
Makes sense.
It's like opening a bank is hard.
I guess. Yeah, I think the shape makes sense to me then, based on what you explained.
Right. So those properties are for reading a value that has already been built.
Right.
And then everything that's left in this proposal is building one.
Mm-hmm.
So, as mentioned, the only way that people should be doing this going forward, if they're part of the public internet, which means they shouldn't, or part of public internet PKI, which means they shouldn't be using this type in the first place, because they should be using a real commercial product, which, hey, maybe is going to be built in terms of this. They should only be using the part where it has a contained subject key identifier for matching. They shouldn't be using issuer and serial name, serial number and issuer name. But again, the spec allows it. Maybe you're doing weird old things. Maybe you're trying to write tests for weird old things. And so I've included all of the options that make sense, which is if you give an issuer name, you give a serial number, because they're always talked about together. Mm-hmm. They're not technically encoded as a tuple. They should have been, but they aren't. And right, so we have a bunch of named create methods to talk about why basically they're 2-byte arrays, and it helps keep them separate. And then I think I have some overloads for you can give an existing subject key identifier extension, or then I have the one Uber helper method at the bottom, which is create from certificate of, given this is the issuer certificate that you're coming from, do you want the key identifier and or do you want the issuer and serial? I have kind of no strong feeling about any of these, so anything that anybody wants to say is complicated, feel free to delete.
I mean, it makes sense to me so far. And they say this is somebody who's generally very ignorant about crypto.
The really long method, create from issuer name and serial number, takes an issuer name and a serial number. So, but yeah.
I mean, it seems fine.
Okay.
And then yeah. So I guess the create one is the one that is just taking everything as is.
Right. So they're all listed as non-nullable. So create is that you're creating it from a full value instead of from a partial value. That you have a key identifier, an issuer name, and a serial number. We could call it create from subject key identifier, issuer name, and serial number, but I figured.
So how is it different from the constructor?
The constructor doesn't take there's not a constructor that takes a key identifier, an issuer name, and a serial number. We could move these creates to be one, but then it feels like they should be nullable instead of like, oh, if you're calling this constructor overload, like it's making sure that the semantics of what has nullable affinity and not stays sane.
Yeah, I don't have any objections to what you have. It's just because you only call it create. Basically, that kind of means there's no, like if you have a named constructor, right, create from blah, right, that you make it clear what this thing is, and this is the only one where you don't have the from syntax. So it seems like you're kind of elevating it to the level of a constructor, but you also have a constructor. So you have a effectively unnamed factory and a constructor, and that just seems odd as a couple.
Right. Well, because the constructor is creating it from an encoded value, and this is creating it from the parts to create an encoded value.
I see. The overloads are basically just different shapes of the raw binary value, and this is actually still doing the work to actually get a binary value out of it.
Right. This turns the pieces into an encoded value, which you can read out of the raw data property from the base class, and then the constructor would take a raw data equivalent value, and then it will populate all the semantic fields.
Interesting.
It's the way these types work. I didn't make them, I just work here.
Yeah, I think that makes sense as well. Kevin, what are your thoughts, given that you're the only other person that understands this domain?
I mean, personally, I'm going to follow Jeremy's advice and not write a CA. So I'm probably not going to be using these types a whole lot. Personally, but I mean, the shape of them makes sense to me. There's some comments on YouTube about some suggestions on maybe renaming the simple issuer further up back to just issuer name, about whether or not simple should be in the property name.
Yeah, so for that one, it's the thing that I worry about of just calling it issuer is if the encoding has an issuer and serial number, but the issuer is not encoded as just an X500 name, then I don't, or if it has more than one X500, I don't remember. There's something about being a non-standard encoding that property will be null because I don't know what to assign it to. And it felt weird to me that it could be null when it just says issuer. But maybe the fact that there's issuer and raw issuer, maybe that helps make it clear enough to the no one who should use it.
Yeah, I don't have strong opinions. I mean, simple issue and raw issue, at least it's a bit unfortunate that there are suffixes, but they make it, there's only 4 properties on this whole type, so hopefully people figure this out. Seems fine to me. I don't have any objection with the name simple. It's just the problem is when you what is simple now might not be simple tomorrow, right? But I think the general concept that you have a quick accessor with a very common encoding makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, we can call it issuer distinguished name. That seems fine to me. And then it'll just in docs say when it's null, or that it may be null even if an issuer name was specified.
So you would call it issuer distinguished name. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
And then you would keep the other one as issuer raw or raw issuer.
I'm still good with raw issuer.
Yeah, I would suggest be consistent. Like if you go with suffix, then go in suffix for both sides, or go in prefix for both sides. But if you now mix them, then it's a... Because before you had raw issue and simple issue, in which case it's both a suffix, right, or both a prefix, depending on viewpoint. Now it's a mixture.
Hey, we can stick with simple issuer, or even just have issuer and raw issuer. And
I mean, named issue also works. You know, that's the other way to do make it a prefix. I would
sure.
Okay, that's the only change we made, I think, right? So then, we cool with that?
Right, so I didn't talk about the bottom two.
Oh.
Which is, while implementing this, I wanted to use a version of the serial number from X509 certificate that A was big Indian encoded, and B didn't necessarily require making a copy.
Mm.
So I added on X509 certificate serial number bytes which for the read-only memory, and then similarly on the subject key identifier extension type that we already have. Right now we have a way of getting the serial identifier or the subject key identifier back as a hex string, and I figured giving us a no copy version of what were the actual bytes seemed useful.
That makes sense. And they're always they're never nullable.
The certificate will always have a serial number. It is not nullable. It will throw an object disposed exception if you have a disposed certificate. Subject key identifier extension. Okay. The one that returns a string. No, so we had this discussion in the prototype issue where I wrote this. So the existing extension has the hex string as nullable because what I don't know, Sean, Brian, whoever wrote this in the long ago, they made it where if you call the default constructor and so you haven't given it any data yet, it will return null. I made this return null changed it later, made it nullable to indicate that same state, and the code just looked super ugly. And because it's if you've read this out of a certificate, so if you are looping over certificate.extensions, it will never be null because the data's there. The only time it's null is if you say default constructor and then read the value. And I've decided that's an exception. Like, I don't care. It calls the decode routine as if you'd given it data. It has no data. It throws an I can't decode this, and then you move on with life. So the nullable just made it super complicated, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can get behind this.
So you're using the type wrong.
My only feedback on those two would be when we added we did the same thing for raw data on X509 certificate 2. The suffix was memory, not bytes. So we added raw data memory.
Okay, I mean, serial number memory, I guess, is okay. Serial number and SKI bytes is. I don't care. I care more that we expose them than what they're called.
So, yeah, I don't care either. I would just be consistent on what the types already do today.
All right. Well, in the case of the certificate, we had the raw data property, which was returning an array, and then we wanted the memory version that didn't make a copy, and so the best name was already taken.
Isn't that
And
true
then-
with serial number though? Except it also returns a little endian or something.
The serial number property on certificate, I think it's a string, and then it has like get serial number, which returns a little endian array. Okay, X509 certificate doesn't have a serial number property.
2 does, but it returns a string. I think
Right.
you have like
so
4 different ways of getting the serial number off the certificate, except the most useful one right now.
right. So the obvious name for the serial number property would be serial number, but serial number was already taken, and it's a string. So I added. So in the proposal, I used bytes to indicate that it's the bytes instead of the hex string. In the case of raw data, if we had called it raw data and raw data bytes, it'd be like, what's raw data if not bytes? Because it's a byte array. But I'm fine with memory. It feels a little weird here because we're disambiguating it for the wrong reason.
Right.
Because this one is its bytes instead of a hex string. And then on the, similarly with the subject key identifier, it's the existing property returns a hex string, and we're saying instead of the hex string, this is the bytes.
So I mean, I generally think bytes is nicer than memory, but I don't have super strong opinions here. Like, I'm not sure which consistency matters.
I think I'm like 78% bytes over memory.
So then we just leave this one as is, because there's no conflict on the same type at least.
Yeah.
All right, so then it's this. All right, so where does this thing again? Here. All right. Then we are done with this one. I think you're still up.
Yep. All right. So this is the Uber issue of what somebody really wants is to be able to load a certificate request from a byte. Sorry, from a byte array. I could read brackets. And all of the preceding things we've talked about over the last 2 sessions have been related to this. And then the last thing that was on my list of we're not going to add this functionality until is the ability to create a certificate revocation list. So the first half of this proposal is creating a certificate revocation list. This is stupidly complicated because CRLs are meant to be used only by people who know what they're doing. And I don't want to give us a CRL reader because they're stupidly complicated. So this is a builder only. And I've dumbed it down a lot. So this is making things possible. And if they want to build a complicated CRL, they get to use ASN Writer. That's the line that I feel that we can justifiably hold ourselves to for the time being. So, a certificate revocation list is a list, unsurprisingly, of a threeple of a serial number, the time it was revoked, and then a collection of extensions, of which only one is actually useful, and that's the reason it was revoked. The reason code is declared mandatory by the current CA browser forum rules. It's also stupid because no one cares what it is, but because it's declared mandatory by CAB forum and Kevin asked for it, I included it in the proposal. So what we have is from a list, so the heading that I have here is building it from nothing, default constructor. You're supposed to know everything that you're planning on revoking, so you call add entry with the serial number and the time it was revoked and an optional reason code. If you don't give a revocation time, we'll use datetime offset UTC now. If you don't give a revocation reason, then we won't write it down. So we won't make up a default for that one. It's null here means not included, and specified it means we'll include the extension for you.
Can you just say it's mandatory?
So the CA browser forum sets the rules for publicly trusted certificate authorities. They say you must include it.
Oh, but it's optional in the underlying format.
Right.
I see.
And
so it's a policy more than
and in Jeremy's complete lack of opinions, it's stupid because nothing that's checking is the certificate revoked cares what the reason is, and they'll never present the reason. Like, no human ever sees it, and it's only intended for humans. So what's the point? But some standards organization says it's a mandatory option. Yep, a mandatory option. Right. So the 3 overloads of add entry are just serial number, big Indian, serial number, big Indian as a span, or you have the certificate that you're planning on revoking. So just pass it in, and I'll call serial number bytes. We could easily get rid of that now that we've added serial number bytes, but it still feels, I don't know, friendly. And then you call add entry as many times as you want, and then you call build. Yes, build is stupid and complicated because every krill, when you're building it, needs to have a number. Personally, I don't see why it would ever exceed a long, but Kevin pointed out that in the spec it says everybody needs to support krill numbers that take up to 20 bytes to encode. So a 160-bit number.
Okay.
And then you have the time that you're going to, the time that by which you will have published a new version of the krill, and then the hash algorithm that you're using when signing it, and then if your certificate's an RSA certificate, you have to give the stupid RSA signature padding option that I couldn't find anywhere else to put. You can tell I'm super happy about this. But this is all the data that you need in order to close it off. Some of this would look like it would make sense in the constructor, but it gets weird when we start talking about the next phase, which is loading an existing list and modifying it.
Right.
So these are, so the overload of build, the first one has next update and doesn't have this update, where again it uses UTC now. But if you're trying to build something for testing, you might want to specify a specific this update. In particular, all of our tests do, so that they get an exact encoding out of the answer. But and you may also have reasons that you care to have said we built this thing 20 minutes ago, or we built it 10 minutes from now. I don't know. Do whatever you want to do. Maybe your clock's not right. So, and this method is very helpful for you. It'll tell you, hey, you're trying to build a krill and your certificate's not even valid for building krills, so maybe you're doing the wrong thing. Yeah. So if you scroll down, we have some other shapes of build.
Like the 2 overloads for build that take the certificate, isn't it? Like, it looks like the only difference is that one takes also a daytime offset. With this update, why isn't this update just optional then?
So we could move this update to a nullable optional parameter, and a value of null would mean use datetime offset.utc now. That would be fine.
Yeah, I think I would probably do that because it's already super complicated, and it just makes it a bit more clear what's.
Okay. I know our standard rule is that once you have 2 defaulted parameters, you should have a simple version that doesn't have it, but I don't think we should do that here.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like, I mean, it's still, you only have 2 optional parameters, right? It's the...
Yeah.
So it's fine. And this is not an API that, is going to be used a lot.
I certainly hope not.
Sorry, what's the rule you're breaking about 2 optional parameters? Or are you just not allowed to have them?
The guidance is once you have 2 or more defaulted parameters, I think it's a consider having an overload that has no default parameters because it makes IntelliSense prettier.
Yeah, this was a result of the Azure API studies, where a lot of their core APIs take like 20 optional parameters. And people didn't know that they were optional because they just show up in brackets in IntelliSense. So there are a lot of people that were desperately trying to fill in all the values. And it turns out that only 2 of them were mandatory, the rest was optional. And so the idea is when you have a lot of optional parameters, just have one overload that just only takes the mandatory ones, so that, it's pretty clear what is required and what isn't. But in this case, like it's the other way around anyway, right? Because you have like, what is it, 4, 5 required parameters and 2 optionals. So I think it's fine. All right, then I guess for build it's the same, right? For the other one it's the same, right?
Right. So, if you've scrolled, it hasn't shown up on Teams.
Oh, sorry, I have not yet.
Right. So, these other 2 versions of build, they come from certificate request.create, which is instead of taking a certificate, you can tell us what name to use. So the issuer name, which is going to be written down in the CRIL, and then we have this type called the X509 signature generator. We don't need the RSA signature padding option here because that will have been included in the generator that you built. So this is taking the certificate and optional RSA signature padding parameter and turning them into 2 differently shaped parameters to match the parameter shapes we came up with on certificate request. Ultimately, this is what does the work. The one that takes the certificate figures out how to build these values for you and then calls the most complicated one at the bottom.
Right.
And so for parity, I guess that means we would make the this update value on this defaulted and collapse those 2 into 1.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion. So we just only have 2 overloads now.
Yep. Yeah. So the optional parameter that we had on add entry was, well, I guess one of them was the X509 revocation reason. This is the .netified version of the names from the spec.
Compromises, they decided to revoke it.
Yeah, this is what is the reason that the certificate got revoked. Usually this means what is the reason that the person who owns the certificate requested that it would be revoked, but it could be other things. So notably, when you scroll, it includes a value called like AA compromise. Yeah. This value will make no sense in .NET. We don't support the thing that's called attribute certificates, but I included it just so there wasn't a hole. Note there is a hole at 7 because the spec skips 7.
Gotcha.
There's no name associated with 7. It's an invalid value.
Yeah,
and then I proposed alternate names if we don't like the 3 capitals in a row of CA compromise would be certificate authority compromise and AA would be attribute authority compromise. I don't care.
I mean, it wouldn't be crypto if there wouldn't be at least one of them, right? So I feel like we have
Indeed.
to keep it as you proposed it. All right, so then
We're not done yet.
what? How is that possible? Oh,
I broke it
no.
into phases so we could understand the shapes.
Oh God, no, you did not. Oh no. All right.
Okay, so for
Oh no.
so the next major scenario would be you've previously written a CRIL and all you want to do is load it, add 1 thing or 2 things to it, and then save it again. So this means we need a load. The only things that you need from load that came from build that you're not gonna, or that you may not know, is what was the current CRIL number when you called save, or I guess when you called build. So this is, load from a byte array, and it will return the object and out what the CRIL number was when it loaded it. You can load from a span, it'll return the list, out the CRIL number, and tell you how many bytes it read from the beginning of the span. For the byte array, it's the whole thing or it throws. And then we have some PIM versions of the load as well. Now, once you've loaded it, in addition to adding things, which we could already do, you may want to remove things. Removing things is hard because you need to know what they were, and I'm not going to give you an iterator because I don't want you to read crills because they're complicated. And so remove entry is the easy one. You know the serial number, we remove it. Or if we find it, we remove it. I feel like Kevin proposed that I change it to Boolean, and I thought I did, but it says void. So we might want those to be bool of yes, I found a serial number with this number and I removed it.
That's true for both expire entries and remove entry, or just remove entry?
Just remove entry. So expire entries is weird. The thinking behind this is since I don't have a way of iterating that you can iterate the list, the one thing that could make sense is you say, I want to remove anything, like I never issue certificates that are longer than 6 months. So since any certificate that would have been issued more than 6 months ago would now be expired, if it was already revoked, the rules are, let's call them ambiguous. And some of them talk about removing things and some of them talk about leaving them forever. But if you want to remove the things that are revocations for expired things, then you can say, hey, anything that got revoked more than 6 months ago obviously doesn't matter. So you get to pass in the cutoff time. And this is the easiest way that I came up with of describing a blanket policy for trimming that didn't require reading the type. Because again, I don't think the usage is high enough to justify the complexity of reading it. If I recall, Kevin thought this was weird, and we can cut it. It just seemed it's the easiest for each thing that I could come up with a way of expressing.
Yeah, I don't have strong opinions on it, but my only thought was, that basically kind of depends on you knowing how long the validity period of every certificate you've ever issued is. So in your example, if it's 6 months long, but okay, great, there's a policy change and now we're changing it to, a 3-month validity period or a 7-month validity period, whatever, just pick a number out of a hat. You can't, since all that's in the CRL is the serial number, you don't really know what it is. So I would expect a lot of people that are using this, I would hope, are kind of doing their own bookkeeping on this of, when it was issued and what the validity period of it is and blah, and when it's time for them to empty out their CRL of things they don't care about, they would just go through their own bookkeeping and call remove entry on it.
Yeah. And I agree
though.
with that general notion. Go ahead, Stefan.
So I've heard you talk about don't write your own CA, and this API is only for CAs. But this is where you're really getting into the meat of where your decisions as far as not making this too nice is being more annoying, because it sounds like you're saying, oh, we hope people track all the stuff they put in there so they know how to remove it. Maybe they have a separate SQLite database or something, right? Because you can't just read the CRIL. I don't know.
That's actually, again, this goes back to if you're really being a CA, there's a whole lot of operational policy. That bookkeeping and ledger is a piece of if you're a real CA, there are I'll call them government forms that you have to be able to fill out that has all of that data in it. So if you're being a real CA, you really do need to have been doing all that bookkeeping and you have that data available.
Yeah, if you're going to pass a web trust audit, a CRL by no means could be an authoritative place of every certificate that has been revoked. Even you will have this ledger of certificates.
Yeah. So then the only difference between remove entry and expire entries is expire entries gets to do, it looks at everything once, and remove entry will, unless you call it in the right order, be n squared. So it has a little ON versus ON squared nicety, but it's not a major issue. The only people it would matter for is Apple with their push notification CRIL, which I don't think they've ever removed anything from, which is why it takes 3 gig of memory to load an OpenSSL. Because Apple. But yeah, so expire entries is, yeah, it's a tiny piece of nicety. Originally I didn't have remove entry because the question was how were you supposed to know, and then the answer is you had to have done your bookkeeping. So I'm fine with removing expire.
I'm happy to keep it too. I don't see any problem with it. I'm just having a hard time imagining scenarios where it will be useful for all but the most trivial cases.
Right. I mean, basically, it assumes that you never change your issuance policy,
So the
or
next-
that you're willing to let some things float. When you you changed from a 6-month validity to an 8-month validity, fine, you'll carry some stuff for 2 extra months.
So then remove until somebody asks for it.
That's fine.
Right. Let's do that then.
Less is more. All right. So next is the only way that the chain engine knows how to find the krill is you have to include a thing called the krill distribution point extension. This piece is weird, kind of like with the SQL decimal. There wasn't really a good place to put it, or the SQL decimal from parts. It's date time, whatever it was. My brain's fried. So you need to be able to build one of these extensions. The only thing that's important is a list of URLs. The extension technically supports a whole bunch of other stuff. I don't care. Nobody needs to read it, so I didn't want to add a reading type for it. They just need to build it from a list of URLs and the Boolean of whether or not it's critical. So I stuck it on the builder type because it's talking about it. One of the proposals, which I think came from Kevin, was go ahead and call it krill distribution point extension and then .create. The problem with that would be we can't return that type because we're not adding a rich type for it. And if we did add a rich type for it, the create method would return the base class, and then you'd have to upcast it. I didn't like that, so I left it on this weird, side API.
So where does this extension go then afterwards, after you constructed it?
So if you're the CA, you would you'd only ever call this once in your process, and you would save it as part of your CA-ness of this is where you put your krills. And then when you're creating new certificates, you would add this extension to the certificate extensions collection on certificate request.
I see.
So this is, I, as the CA, declare that you, with your krill will be over there. And for most CAs, all issued certificates get the same krill. But that's a policy thing.
That works.
So build, create, I don't care.
And remind me again what critical does?
Sets a bit.
So it's not a .NET thing, it's just a...
It's a spec thing. It's if you are a certificate processing system and you see an extension that is marked as critical and you don't know what it means, you're supposed to say you don't support this. Don't support the certificate.
I see. It's basically their version of mod op, mod rec.
Right. So at false it's mod opt, and at true it's mod rec. And again, in the fact that I defaulted that to false means page 45. That somewhere here it'll say a CA should declare this non-critical. Yes, I printed this. It's ridiculous. I had to figure out how our printers work because apparently they've changed. This extension should be non-critical.
All right then.
Okay, and now the thing that people actually asked for, which is to be able to load a signing request.
Jesus
So, yeah, it's mostly overloads. So the one thing that was missing from the current API is if you built a thing with just the type we call public key, when we got to sign, if you were using RSA, we didn't know which padding to use, and we would throw an exception. So this adds this adds the RSA signature padding as a defaulted parameter as an overload to the existing constructor, just so if you're doing RSA, you have a place to pass it.
Are you saying we already have certificate request as the type?
Yeah.
I see.
This is a place where people could build requests and they could save them and send them to a CA, and then we've had people asking us for years, I can save these, why can't I load them? And the answer is because it's dangerous and you're trying to be a CA. So when we built this type, there are extra attributes that it supports that we didn't add encoding for. We only added support for the special attribute called a certificate extension request attribute. And we've had some requests for people who want to use the challenge password attribute. And when you're loading them, certainly there could have been attributes present. So this now adds a collection of ASN encoded data called other request attributes. So other means not the certificate extension request attribute.
Makes sense.
In fact, we'll throw if you add that attribute in there and then call build, because it had a special dedicated API. So now we just get load. Give me some input. Tell me what algorithm you plan on signing with when you're done, because we already required that in the constructor, and reshaping the API is hard now. Then we have an optional parameter. Should you skip verifying the signature? So these things are signed. So by default, we will check the signature, but if you really want to skip it, you can pass true. There are reasons that you have to. Like not all request types actually support being signed. And then we have the super most fun contentious part of the proposal, which is unsafe load certificate extensions. We are defaulting it to false. And what this means is when it sees the certificate extension request attribute, it's just going to ignore it. So if you call certificate request.load and you don't explicitly pass this as true, then the certificate will not have a subject alternative name. It will not have, it will not be claiming the right to be a CA. It won't be doing most of the scary things that it could possibly do. And this saves you the trouble of verifying that what it asked to do was reasonable. And if you pass true, then we'll just load everything in, and you said true, and it's on you now to verify anything that you need to verify. Yeah. And then the RSA signature padding, because, you know, that's why we added it in the constructor. YouTube says Emo's camera is offline and everyone's real quiet. Do I still have audio?
Yes, you're still working. I think Emo's the one that is currently offline. He was just bragging about how great his internet was too.
Mm-hmm. He cursed it. His internet must still be working, because I can see me moving. Must be something bad going on at his house.
No, I was just grabbing a Coke, sorry.
Fair enough. All right, so assuming nobody has objection with unsafe load certificate extensions, then all that we have after that is that you can load it using the bytes form or the string form from PEM, and then because we added support for reading it from PEM, we're overloading create signing request to have create signing request PEM, so you can create the PEM in the first place.
I guess I don't have a problem with this scenario. I just think that having it only on a parameter is a bit odd, because unless you use named parameter convention, like, you can't see it at the call side. Right, so somebody could just call the API, pass in true, null, right? And then it's like, well, now he did something unsafe that you can't see. I think the other alternative would be we just duplicate the entire API surface, right? And then have basically load signing request, and then we have unsafe load signing request.
Unsafe load signing request with certificate extensions, yeah.
Well, you could keep the other ones as is, right? You could keep the other one as
I just think
oh, I see. You need to see.
we would
Yeah,
put the more words after or as a suffix to explain why we put unsafe on the
I see.
thing. And the unsafety in this one is that really this is having this be true and then blindly calling create, which creates the certificate from the way that the request is built, is the most dangerous thing you can do as a CA, because you're basically giving away the keys to the castle. So anybody who passes true here, I had a sample. I wrote it in a test project because I needed a place that I could evaluate the code that I had just written, and I think it came out to like 2,000 lines long. And Kevin said, this does not look like a test. I was like, I know. But this is the minimum amount of work that somebody needs to do if they, well, now if they pass true. At the time, it was not a condition.
I wish I knew that wasn't a unit test before I started like looking at it for 30 minutes.
I had a comment. It said this is just showing the scenario. But yes. So passing true is just complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think normally, the unsafe convention makes more sense for API calls. It's a bit weird for parameters.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like with parameters, I mean, unless we could enforce it, you have to specify the parameter, then it can get lost, right? That's the that's the concern. Like, you wanted to see in a code review, right? If somebody submits a PR, right? You don't want to sneak in a comma true, and then it's like, oh shit, you just did something really bad.
Right. It looks like in chat, Frederick is suggesting, I think, take the skip signature validation and unsafe load certificate extension and move them to a flag xenum.
That's not a bad idea, because
certificate request load mode, default skip signature validation, and unsafe load certificate extensions.
I think that would work. Yeah, this one you also see them at the call side.
Yep.
How will we name this, Enum?
He called it certificate request load mode. Seems like a reasonable name to me.
Load mode, and then we would have...
Or we could call it certificate request load options, or whatever.
And that would be flags, right?
Yeah, so flags, and then we'd have default, and then just Pascal case the two parameters.
So default would be 0, right?
Yeah.
And then you would have skip
signature validation and unsafe load certificate extensions. It's a long word. It starts with unsafe. Don't do it. But I do like your point of now it shows up in, like...
Yeah.
I mean, you can write 3 if you really want, but you now had to go out of your way to hide what you're doing.
Yeah, if somebody wants to do something bad, they can always do something bad, right? It's really more about accidents, I guess.
Yep.
And then the options you would default to 0, right? Which means
Yeah, we could default that to 0.
they would have.
I was gonna say we should make it a formal parameter, but no, we should default it to 0.
Yeah, I like that, I think.
Okay, and then there's just a tiny thing that was annoying me while I was writing all these tests on X509 basic constraints extension, and this kind of just rounds out the whole scenario of what you need to do when you're a CA. When you're ready to scroll.
When you do the things that you're not supposed to do.
So X509 basic constraints extension has one constructor that lets you build one. And it takes a boolean, an int, and a boolean. And nobody knows what they mean. And so I've decided maybe I can help them by having create for certificate authority and create for indentity, which is the first boolean. And then the second boolean and int is actually just nullable event. But that only applies if the first boolean was true. And then the second boolean is the critical boolean that we've seen on the other extensions. The rules say if you are a CA, so if you pass true in the first one, you should pass true in the last one. And so in this overload, or in this named alternative to the constructor, I just took away the option. It doesn't even accept the critical. It will just pass true.
Makes sense.
And then for indentity, the spec is a little more lackadaisical, so I left it as a defaulted to false. Because usually the calls, at least in our tests, are true, false, 0, true, or false, false, 0, false. And I was just tired of seeing those in our tests. And it's like, I'm going to give these things names.
That works.
And that's it.
Only 122 lines. Not bad.
Yeah.
I assume the rest people on the other people on the call dropped off because they don't care. Is that what happened?
I don't have too many opinions, and most of the things that I would have said are kind of like not super high value. Like, why is create signing request PIM not default value? You seem to be using default values a lot, but honestly, it doesn't matter much.
Just so the create signing request PIM, we have create signing request currently, which returns byte array, and so it's just symmetry against it didn't take a defaulted parameter. Because at the time it was written, we weren't using them.
Makes sense.
So here it is now. I will click comment because there's no way I can fit it all on one screen. Then you can read it on your side.
Yep.
Tell me whether that works out. And then I'll just mark it as approved.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry for the ones I put to sleep.
That's okay. We just revoke their review permissions now. Now that we have the APIs to do it. All right. Rate limit options. Will, are you still with us or did you drop off?
I guess he's supposed to be today, but he said to ping him, so I will try.
I thought he was in earlier. I thought I saw him.
I mean, he messaged.
He did ask to be poked when his issue came up.
Exactly. But I can speak for it.
All right, then go for it.
So I'm not even... Okay, let me look at what you're showing. So the issue here is that this options type is being used in ASP.NET apps. This is like one of the first main use cases for this rate limiting abstraction is ASP.NET rate limiting middleware. It's the, we've had a lot of design around it, and we're starting to do blog posts, and it's all endpoint aware and it's fancy. But one thing that is unconventional for ASP.NET apps is to have non-settable options objects. And this has to do a lot with like our options pattern in Microsoft extensions, which is like I options of T and DI and stuff. And that's not what's going on here. But still, basically, developers in ASP.NET apps are used to writing code like that versus I kind of wish we had the old code there, but basically instead of having options in a callback, right, you would have to do new and then the option type name. You could do target type new and then pass in all the parameters, and it ends up being honestly a lot harder to read and like leads people to write like really long lines. Like, yes, you can, new up types with a lot of parameters on multiple lines. But anyway, this is just more fitting with expectations is mostly what it comes down to.
So, Stefan, does this change something that this is changing the options type from immutable to mutable?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're going to have to be careful to like snapshot all the values and so forth.
That was going to be my question is, does the implementation snapshot, or is the expectation that you can actually change these options anytime and they're respected?
That is not the expectation. And currently it's, quote unquote immutable because there are no setters. So we don't snapshot it, but with this change we would.
And that's going to be presumably because you're only creating these things super rarely, the snapshotting, the extra cost associated with whatever allocations there. We're not going to be back here next week like, oh, this is allocating, so now we need to make this a struct or whatever, right?
Right, that is the presumption there. The only time we'd have to recreate, we could snapshot this because this is called once per app, so this is fine for us.
And is it?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain scenarios where it's called like once per creation, the rate limiter, but even then we're allocating the rate limiter and a bunch of other things. Sorry.
Does the rate limiter currently give back its options after construction?
Not really. I mean, obviously it affects its behavior, but not like in any real sense.
But there's not like a property that you can ask what it's. There's not a property that will return the options it was built with. Which would then have the same question of if somebody modifies that value, what would happen?
Definitely no. Yeah.
And then the snapshotting that you need to do, do you need a public code method, or is it good enough to just have it as internal?
This is internal. I mean, these are options for a sealed rate limiter implementation. So no one else is really going to need to clone it.
Okay.
I assume there are existing constructors that aren't shown here?
Well, yes, yeah. There's the that's what we went with. Is basically a constructor for all these parameters with all the default values. If you go on source.net, it's up there, so you can just look at the type as it stands and see the constructor.
My question is, we still want those constructors?
I mean, I think they're less necessary. There certainly is an argument for having like one way to do it. I could see the argument either way. I mean, it would break users of the previews, right? Like anyone who configured these options before if we remove that constructor, but it's a preview.
I think it's fine to keep it. My concern would just be if we think this options bucket is going to grow over time, those constructors are going to go stale quick.
Exactly.
If we think they're not, then having a constructor is fine.
Yeah, I don't really anticipate a bunch of growth here. Hard to say, to be, hard to say. I don't see anything, but can't promise that there won't be.
Is there any cross? I haven't looked at the code recently. Is there any cross-property validation that happens here? Like, does the constructor do any validation beyond isolated to an individual parameter? Like, none of these are objects, but
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, it's all local. Like they're just limits on each individual parameter that are static ranges. Like can't be less than 0 kind of stuff.
okay, that's fine to me.
So that means we keep the existing constructor that initializes everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me.
The only thing, and this is sad, so I think we talked about this change in principle. We're gonna have to send an email API follow-up because like this isn't the only options that needs to change. But like I mean, you see all the types there. I mean, we could go and simulate it right now, but I'll update the issue and send out an email because I know you like to actually have the full API diff when you approve it. But yeah, up to you.
I do think it would just be prior to that email, talk with Will and whomever. If now that we're adding all of these setters and presumably people are going to want to specify as little as possible, just double check whether we still do want the constructors or whether the only constructor we want is the parameter response.
Yeah, makes sense. Sorry.
What's the breaking change tolerance for the current point in time for whatever ring this type is in?
For us.
I mean, we haven't shipped it, so.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's fairly, the tolerance is high.
I just know for
API
most of the
been,
BCL, we have there shouldn't be breaks between RC1 and RC2.
Yeah, this is new API though, and the first like real shot people have got at is Preview 6, and as you know, with our release cadence, we can't really get feedback until like a release later, basically.
We also have RC1.
That's true.
Do we have
can
any?
break
I guess
if we want to.
Yeah, well, and I guess RC1, I don't think we've final built yet, so this could be cross-ported if we want to pre-float the break. But
we haven't even forked for an RC1 branch yet.
Right. Preview 7, RC1 is what all this stuff goes into. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, so that is nice.
I'm
All
off
right.
by a
Yep.
release label in my head.
Yeah, but even if it were RC1, but yeah, it's a very valid point.
So how about we remove the constructor then, and then it just becomes a normal new up, initialize what you need, and then be done type.
Yeah, I'm fine. We can always add the constructor back. We can make enough people mad. But yeah, no, I think it will be fine to remove the constructor. I'll update the issues to do that, or update this comment and so forth.
I mean, the argument. I mean, if we have setters for everything, I'd rather not have the constructor because that means we don't have to add more constructors as we add more properties, right? Otherwise, we're in this weird
Right.
limbo state where we now have to do all of it, like having settable things and keep adding to the constructor. That seems like the worst of all worlds.
I agree.
So Will is here for his opinion now on the removing
Yeah,
the
sorry.
current constructor.
Looks like I missed part of this. It sounds like you're talking about removing the constructor we have now in case we had properties going forward. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I don't have any opposition to that.
Exactly it.
My
Yeah.
only question is, I see it's pasted in, and I don't see default values on the first few things, at least that are shown on the screen. Is that just because they're not in what was copy pasted, or are there actually some required properties there?
The only one
Required
that is
for
this
what?
one here is this one. That's the only defaulted one.
We default more, or we were discussing that in the issue, right? So yeah, if that's something we want to discuss, we probably should. If you scroll up.
Yeah, so
Um,
I mean, there's a difference obviously between constructor parameters that are defaulted versus not. If they're required, you lose that requirement with the get setters that's on the screen right now.
I see.
Right, which means you either move to delayed errors of it throws that token per period of 0 made no sense, or you accept the notion that tokens per period 0 means the implementation does whatever it wants, or you start this option off with an opinion instead of 0.
Exactly. So Brennan's proposal here, and I'm not super opinionated on that, is like we default everything with valid values. Like to your point, Jeremy, like we could default it to invalid values and then do all our validation in the rate limiter constructor when it when it consumes and copies the options.
Well, that's actually an important distinction. So we ran into problems with this with like SSL Stream, where it started expressing this is a good default to have, and then we needed to change the default, and we couldn't. And so the way that you tell SSL Stream do whatever you think the right thing is now you have to tell it do nothing. And it's like, well, nothing is stupid, so I'm going to make up an answer. So in one sense, having tokens per period and other similar values start off as something like 0, which would make no sense in context, and then have that be passed all the way into the implementation, and it makes up a default that gives you flexibility of changing your default in the future.
I mean, I guess, but like, I mean, you have the same problem in the API pattern, right? Because if that is the pattern people use in ASP.NET, well, then clearly ASP.NET at least had to provide the defaults, right? Because somebody had to call the constructor to provide the options argument, right? So,
right. Well, either there's a default that's already expressed here, or the default that's expressed here is 0, which means that the implementation gets to pick whatever it wants to do.
yes. I mean, I guess my point is just we can decide to say we have a constructor that requires them, but then that wouldn't work for cases like this here, right? So
Correct.
That's basically why I would suggest we don't have the required parameters at all, and we just say the default constructor initializes them to whatever values this thing would have done anyways. Or we basically decide that we don't do that, and we just say once you actually call the API, now the thing will fail later with, hey, you have to provide a value, right? But I think it seems to me weird to have a mixture of both. If that makes sense.
I'd lean more towards like doing 0 and then throwing if they remain 0, because it's very difficult to come up with a reasonable definition of what a good default would be for a rate limiter. It's like really context specific. So I would be all right with having the defaults all be basically 0. And then like there's already in the constructors of the predefined limiters, they already throw if you were to pass like a less than 0 or a 0 or less value for those. That's already the case today.
This is my position too. Basically, I think the only sensible default for a rate limiter is basically the no-op one, because like otherwise, like, yeah, like 1 token per second is a default, but it's pretty arbitrary. And yeah, I would kind of be okay with forcing people to configure that part of it.
So what would you do today, though, in order to make the call side on the screen work? I mean, somebody had to call token rate limiter options and pass in a token limit, right? Did you pass in 0 for those?
The only difference between this and the way that things work today is people would construct an instance of a token bucket limiter options with essentially these arguments.
No, I get what the resulting thing is. I'm saying, in order to make this API call that's on the screen right now work with today's APIs, somebody had to, like ASP.NET had to call new token bucket rate limiter options and pass in a value for token limit. And I'm asking, did you pass in 0 today for those? And then basically rely on the user in the callback to actually say token limit to some sensible value, or did you pass in some non-zero?
They added a default constructor, and presumably it was 0 in that one.
No, so there wasn't. So that, or sorry, that's the proposal here, but we haven't yet. So with the constructor that was being removed, right, there is no default value. So there is a loss here, right? And the loss being, like, if we don't default these all to valid values, there's nothing in the type signature that tells you what's required, like, which is unfortunate.
Which is kind of
why you can't solve it with required properties, because this is your pattern that you have here is somebody else created an options and you're modifying it, when the option that the API really needs is, and give me some options. Like, really, it's that the current type is not compatible with this pattern, but I don't think the current type, honestly, I don't think we should make it compatible with this pattern. It doesn't make sense. But if you want to make it compatible with this pattern, then people can hit F5 and fail, and then set a property, and hit F5 and fail and set a property, and keep going until they run out of properties that tells them they didn't set.
Well, that's why I would, I think the exception message you want is not one property at a time. I think the message you want to have is something like token limit, queue processing order, queue limit, and replenishing period that require properties. Please initialize them correctly, right?
Fair enough.
So that you don't have to do this F5, F5, F5 until it works.
Yeah, and it's not amazing, right? Like that. Yeah, there's like this thing that we're now not validating at compile time, though we could, of course, write an analyzer or something. We could always say that. I doubt we would. But there are a lot of things in ASP.NET there. If you configure it wrong, it's a startup exception, right? And that's what this would basically be in most cases.
Yeah. I mean, it also I assume we don't really have a project template that spits out this line, right? It would always be something somebody would have to write from scratch, presumably.
Right. We have samples today, but not a template.
Yeah. So then, I mean, this is the general problem, I think, with this API pattern, right, which is callback based, where you already have the options constructed for the user. I mean, maybe we have a different breaking change policy for default values in ASP.NET, and maybe we just find it okay to say, hey, this, you know, we have a parameterless constructor, but ASP.NET already initialized those values to something sane, so we don't have the failure. And then if we ever want to change the token limit to something else, we can, because the breaking change policy for ASP.NET is lower than for the, you know, threading rate limiting API, right? That's another way to deal with this problem, I guess.
But anyway, all these caveats said, like, I agree with Will, like, let's default these to 0. That's going to be like invalid for tokens per period, because it's basically would be always blocking, right? But
that already is
fine.
invalid.
Exactly, but we would have the difference, I guess, is now it's not like a required parameter in a constructor, but you could have always tried to pass in 0, and it would be just as invalid, and it would be just as much of a runtime error. So yeah, I think it makes sense. Like, anyone who's adding a token bucket rate limiter is probably that's the thing they would want to configure, right? It's like tokens per period. Otherwise, like, what are you doing? So I think it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I generally prefer when the API helps still steer people correctly, but I agree it's following a pattern.
I mean,
I don't agree with the pattern, but I agree it's following it.
I mean, you could imagine that we write an analyzer for these kind of things, right? That would also not be unreasonable.
We could. It feels like it's probably hard to get right, but it can probably cover the 99% case okay.
Yeah. And realistically, that's all you need, right? Because the analyzer would just make sure that people understand what the expectations are more than anything. You don't have to handle like complicated control flow in the callback, right? You would just say, hey, in this callback, did you ever assign this property, yes or no, right?
Right. But you could end up with composition where some things will have already been set and you only need to put in the last one. And if you're that unique and special snowflake, you can just suppress the analyzer.
Right. Yeah, I would probably limit it not to the initialization. I would probably just detect these callbacks, and then if you're in the context of these callbacks, you know there's nothing else.
Frederick, who is being extremely helpful today, thank you, Frederick, asks something for like an attribute like data annotation required, and then have an analyzer that just generically looks for that. I think we need to see a proposal and what it would actually do to see if we could genericize it, but it's an interesting thought.
I understand. How would that differ from required in C#?
Required in C# is right after the constructor, and the problem with this pattern is the person who's setting the properties is far away from the constructor.
I see.
And so this would be for the ASP options callback pattern of you're expected to set this property.
Yeah.
Basically coding in the fact that when the lambda returns, it's considering it constructed.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and it should probably be a secondary attribute, because the problem with the C# required thing is I think languages that don't understand it, I don't think get to set them at all, right? Wasn't that the problem?
The other thing is like with the general options pattern, there's like configuration binding. So like it's an interesting idea, but it would be hard to get right.
Yeah.
Are there no cases ASP.NET passes the same object into multiple callbacks?
Oh no, that happens too. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons that it would be difficult.
Yeah, so I don't know how that would work.
Yeah, if you do that, then okay.
Right, and that's why I said here it could be with chaining. It could be that you're expecting that you're just overwriting one of the values and that somebody else actually set the rest. And
yeah,
that's why I called you the unique and special snowflake.
Yeah, I mean,
So what was the ending? Go ahead.
No, yeah, so saying if that's common, then all bets are off. Right? At that point, you just give up and then say the pattern is too complicated to have an analyzer for that, which might be fun.
And you get you hit F5 and it says, well, we ran all the links in your chain and nobody set token limit, so fail.
Yeah, that's an ASP.NET design problem, right? I think the other problem you have with this kind of pattern is that you end up in a world where you get an exception, but you don't know the line of code you have to touch because it's somewhere in your combination of 1,200 chains, right? But that's, again, this comes back to what do you want the experience to be, I guess.
Yeah, it's not even code. Next thing you know, you have to edit your app settings. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you've configured and chained everything.
I mean, that's a fair point, right? If you do this ASP.NET style where you have like environment variables and like, the JSON file and yes, you might have to touch different places. It is
fair
what
enough.
It is. All right.
To be clear, this isn't exactly that pattern. This isn't being like iOptions injected, but yeah, it's similar.
Well, it could be, but I guess it depends on how you chain it together, right?
Right now, based on these type changes, we could use it that way. We don't plan to, but yeah, in theory.
All right, so then, yeah, I guess it depends on the other types you're thinking about, right? You said like that's not the only type, right? But I think the general problem is conceptual, right? It's like you in this pattern you just can't express what's required because you have multiple sites setting it, you have multiple sources you consider. And then, yeah, it's just the end result is somebody had to set the value, but you can only validate it at the very end. So,
yeah, that's basically, yeah.
So, what's wrong with the approach of just having valid defaults for all of them and validating in the setters whether the value being passed in is valid?
So my argument against that was for something like token bucket rate limiter, there is no like sensible default. Like for a rate limiter in certain places as default, we've used like no rate limiter, right? Where we just let everything pass through. If you're creating a token bucket rate limiter, that's pretty clearly not what you want. So what's the default? Like 1 token per second? I don't know.
So API shape aside, what would your ideal be in the ASP.NET callback model? Like what would the ideal code you would want someone to write be? If you're forcing them to, if the argument is they have to specify it, but you're giving them the instance, what do you want it to be?
Right. So the minimum would be tokens per period and replenishment period. I think without those, it would fail to construct the token bucket rate limiter.
Well, and token limit.
At that case, and so the add token bucket limiter method will throw an exception.
No, the construction of the rate limiter would.
Right, we wouldn't be able to throw until that callback actually got invoked. We have
the callback's not invoked as part of calling add. It's called later when you actually do the build.
yeah, when the first time that that token bucket limiter actually gets created, which doesn't happen in add token bucket limiter. Add token bucket limiter itself constructs a callback.
So, I mean, this going back to what I said earlier, your ideal is actually that they have to set these properties. Short of you adding an analyzer for it, they're just going to get asynchronous exceptions later on.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, in fairness, you could also just change the way the pattern works, right? I mean, currently you have the callback pattern where you're getting passed in an instance, right? But you could easily have a pattern that looks more like this, right? Where you basically, the caller constructs it, right? In which case the regular C# required mechanism would just work fine for this.
So that is the current API. So the problem with it is like not everyone does target type new. I think you had need the parentheses, but anyway, like it doesn't matter. Like we've seen the code that people write, and it's unconventional. People think it looks weird in ASP.NET apps, and it often ends up with like really long lines and people writing out the type name for the options and so forth.
I mean, I get it, but at some point, you introduced the callback-based pattern, and like before you did it, it also looked weird, right? Like I think it just comes down to like, do you use it, often enough to make it a pattern? But I think the problem really is if the pattern fundamentally has a design flaw, maybe that's worthwhile, considering as a way moving forward, right? Because I don't think it looks that weird, right? I mean, if you have a rule that says don't use target type new, I mean, sure, but then I would also argue this goes back to when people say I don't see the types. Well, you don't see the types here either, right? So it's like I don't know why new would be special in that regard, but yeah, I guess it really comes down to like what how much help do you want to give the people with the type system you have. But I think the difference really is like if you really truly believe there shouldn't be a default, the only other option you have is like fail at startup, right? But the other option is you do give defaults and you just say if you don't like them, override them, which is, I guess, case by case, right? For some things you just can't, and for some things you can.
If we do give defaults, and it is hard to come up with what's reasonable for that, if we think it's a problem that people aren't going to know they need to configure their own, like we do in this example, then if we give them some sort of reasonable defaults, like the discoverability of that is even lower, because there will be something real running and we don't give them any information that says, hey, you're just using the default, and then there's only one token allowed per period and the queue limit's 1 and everything's 1, and the behavior is sort of bizarre in that case.
I mean, that's the problem, right?
Right.
Like you don't want to have defaults that work, but then basically have these side effects that you only find out 3 months into production, and then everything goes to shits and you have no idea what went wrong.
Yeah.
So that's the case where you just want to fail early and say, no, you need to specify value here.
Yeah. No, but I'm understanding the complaint, right? There's like a suggestion and exasperation because like we're losing this thing where the previously, like even when there was a runtime exception, right, for like setting 0 as your tokens per period, which is invalid, that at least was where you constructed the options object. Now it's like whenever the rate limiter is constructed, which like sometimes might be at the startup of your app, sometimes might be like lazily on the first request that like would need such a rate limiter, and then like what's that, an error log? And it's like I see the pain, like I feel it. That being said,
although that's up to you, right? I mean, nothing really prevents you from doing that validation basically as part of add token bucket limiter, right? Like you wouldn't have to construct necessarily the actual token rate limiter, but you could just construct the options and say, well, did the person specify all the things I expect, right? And then fail early.
in this particular example. So let's see. So for all of the policies that take in options, that would work. The one place where, yeah, no, yeah, that's true. And honestly, yeah, that is a very valid point. And the error during runtime could happen, but it could happen today, where you have to new up the options objects because we have that like partition rate limiter.create pattern where you might actually return a rate limiter that you create lazily, and presumably if you late bind those options, errors could happen after startup. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of the nature of a beast. At least those errors would be in the options type and not the rate limiter constructor. But honestly, I don't think the exception coming from the rate limiter constructor is that confusing. Like, where did I get my invalid arguments from, right? So yeah, I'm trying to be sympathetic, but I don't think it's that bad.
I mean, it really comes down to the exception message, right? If the exception message is intelligent, and we have seen this in usability studies, people tend to understand what's going on. If you tell them you need to pass in these other things because of this thing, like it tends to work reasonably well.
Yeah, in YouTube chat, Frederick was saying something about the options builder and a validate method with the data annotations. Is that something that is options and doesn't apply here? Or does that make you go, oh yeah, that's exactly what we want?
I think there are issues perhaps for validation of options. It's not a feature I'm aware of.
Data annotations.
The thing is, there's other
simple stuff, not for complicated stuff. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I know that there's like an issue to support like data annotations or something. There's a bunch of options types in .NET, so maybe it's referring to something else.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I mean, like any sort of mutual dependence you can't express, right? You would have to write custom code that says, oh, because you specify these two options, you also have to specify these other four, right? You can't express that. So there's always going to be some amount of like custom code somebody has to write, but having a pattern where there's a validate method on options that you can call, that seems reasonable.
It seems just like a little much right now. Like we'll have good doc comments. It will throw when you pass the options into the constructor if it's invalid. That's how you can validate.
Yep.
I think that's good enough.
Yeah, I think we buy a lot with a like verbose and informative exception message.
Especially that. Yep.
Yeah.
Right, so then I think we're done for today because we're out of time. So for Thursday, we would do the code analysis one, do the regex one, and then I think maybe the WinForms one. I think they're back with an API proposal.
Don't suppose anybody wants to stomach the unsupported OS platform attribute on MD5 right now. It should take like 30 seconds.
That works.
So we have these two consts on the MD5 types, which is hash size and bits and bytes. And because we put the unsupported OS attribute on the type, we can't talk about the consts even when it makes sense to. And that annoys me, and apparently Kevin, because he opened the issue. So we just want to move it from the type to all of the instance, or all of the things that would actually do work. So all the static methods and the constructors.
So why would
I included the whole shape here, but.
So, I mean, I understand the statics, but why would you do it on the instance ones? Oh,
Sorry, I did it on the constructors and the statics.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. No, I misread it earlier. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Basically,
Chat just started flowing again. Weird.
Yeah.
There's no way to instance using like a factory method somewhere else. I mean, I don't remember all the APIs in this space. You know, there used to be like the tokenfig stuff and whatever else.
Well, like crypto config can give you one back, and so on not on the HMAC type, but on MD5 there is the static create, and so that's marked as well. But really, this is just where we see things like if you see this OID, then it will be MD5 hash size in bytes long, and we get oh, you can't talk about that on browser. It's like it's a const. We can talk about it.
Yeah.
And then we
I understand that.
I was suppresses.
I'm fine with the concept. I was just double checking that there aren't other things that might give you back a strongly typed HMAC MD5 that aren't the constructors.
The crypto config create from name that you get to pass in gibberish and it returns object, that one certainly can.
But that's also already marked obsolete, right?
Probably. It's certainly marked as not good for trimming. But
I mean, I don't think there's anything that would be strongly typed, right? I mean, the most you would probably get is the abstract base type like HMAC or crypto algorithm or something, right? In which case the annotation on the type would have also not given you any help.
Right.
I don't think there's anything that gives you back a strongly typed HMAC MD5.
Okay. Yeah, because okay, cool. Because just changing my question around, having it on the type means that if there was such a thing,
Right.
if you were able to get it, then all of the instance methods would also warn you, and now they won't.
Correct.
To my recollection, we have nothing would return HMAC MD5 or MD5 as a strong type that is not the constructor on HMAC MD5 or MD5.create.
What about things that return non-strongly typed that people cast?
Yeah, then you're screwed.
Because today you get the warning for the cast, but now you won't.
That's correct, yes.
They would have had no reason to cast it because everything that they would want on it would have been on the base class.
I mean, that's fair, but people do weird stuff.
I would also point out that MD5 is kind of an outlier in the way this is done. All of the other primitives that are not supported on browser, like DSA or RC2 or whatever, they all do it on the factory methods. I don't know why MD5 ended up in the shape that it did, but if we're concerned about that particular behavior, then it would not be unique to the MD5 classes.
So I guess that's my other question. Like, I mean, there's nothing specific about. I mean, basically, you're saying the other ones already do this thing where they don't put it on the types, right? And,
yes,
and that would be my general suggestion. Like, whatever we decide here is the right thing to do the constructors and the statics, we should do this on all the other crypto types as well. It seems weird to just do it on this one because you happen to want to access the consts here.
Right. This is making this one look like the others. MD5 is the only one that we end up pragmating.
So then I don't know why we did that then. I think we probably just messed up at that point.
Yeah, I think we're going quick at whatever release we added those.
We don't want it on the protected constructor as well.
Technically, since MD5 is abstract, you could derive from MD5 and make your own implementation entirely and managed, and the protected constructor would work. That is also a small reason why you might want to get it off the type, is because there is nothing stopping people from deriving from it and implementing it.
Yep. Fair enough. So yeah, if you basically say then this one is just making it consistent with the other ones, that's fine. Yep. But I think we should be consistent. That would be my only feedback for this.
Yeah, this should be making it consistent.
Oh god, no, I have to copy the whole thing.
Thanks, everybody.
Alrighty then.
Thank you.
Then I see you guys back on Thursday. Thanks, Chet.